call it a night. Your quiet corner of calm where you can find a moment of peace and relaxation.
We're glad you're joining us this evening. Please subscribe to support our channel. Tonight, we will embark on a fascinating journey into the world of Jane Austen, a name that has enchanted readers for centuries. In this lecture, we'll unravel the secrets behind Austen's beloved novels, revealing how she transformed literature. You'll discover how her stories not only reflect the social mores of her time. Get ready to uncover the magic behind Austen's writing and understand why her novels continue to enchant and provoke thought centuries later. Prepare for an exploration that promises to bring Jane Austen's world vividly to life. Sweet dreams and enjoy the journey.
Imagine you're stepping into the quaint village of Chawton in Hampshire, where one of England's most beloved authors, Jane Austen, spent her later years. Austen's life here was a blend of modesty and creativity, reflecting the same themes that run through her novels. One of Chawton's main attractions is the Grand Chawton House, an Elizabethan manor that stands as a testament to the history and social structures of Austen's time. Owned by her brother Edward Knight, a wealthy man who was richer than even the famed Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, Chawton House was a place where Jane Austen, though welcomed, was still acutely aware of her lower social standing. You can think of her position here as somewhat similar to Miss Bates from Emma, present but not entirely on equal footing with the elite. Chawton House isn't just a relic of the past, it's a living piece of history, now a charitable trust that attracts literary enthusiasts, media personalities, and even actors who have portrayed Austen's characters on screen. But while Chawton House draws much attention, it's not the only reason people visit this village. Just a short distance away, you'll find a much humbler abode, the house where Austen lived with her mother, sister, and close friend Martha Lloyd. Described by Mrs. Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility as a very snug little cottage, this home was where Austen quietly worked on her now famous novels. It was a simple life, full of shared chores and a modest income, but within those walls, Austen revised old drafts and crafted new masterpieces like Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. This cottage, now the Jane Austen's House Museum, offers visitors a tangible connection to the author. Among its many treasures are silhouette portraits, personal jewelry, and a quilt stitched by Austen herself. But perhaps the most evocative item is a small walnut tripod table where she wrote. Imagine the scene: Austen, seated in the common sitting room, jotting down her thoughts while life carried on around her. She had no private study, and her writing was often interrupted by visitors or household activities. Yet, she managed to create some of the most enduring works of English literature. Austen's writing process was both a passion and a necessity. She wrote incessantly, even when her health was failing. In Winchester, just days before her death, she continued writing, switching to a pencil when holding a pen became too difficult. Her dedication to her craft was unwavering, even as she faced the challenges of getting her work published, a struggle that lasted until the final years of her life. As you explore the manuscripts and letters that survive, you can almost feel Austen's presence, her frustrations, and her determination. Her early works, like Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, faced rejection and delays before finally seeing the light of day. Despite these challenges, Austen's novels went on to become literary classics, renowned for their sharp wit, insightful characterizations, and innovative narrative techniques. Jane Austen's genius lay in her ability to blend the familiar with the revolutionary. On the surface, her novels might seem like conventional stories of courtship and marriage, but beneath that lies a complex web of social commentary, humor, and psychological depth. Austen's mastery of free indirect style, allowed her to narrate in a way that was both third-person and deeply personal, reflecting the inner lives of her characters with remarkable clarity. Even as we celebrate her achievements, it's important to recognize that Austen was writing in a time when the novel was still evolving as a genre. She had to navigate the expectations of her readers and the demands of the market, but she did so with a skill that has kept her work relevant for centuries. Today, Austen's novels continue to resonate with readers worldwide, offering insights into human nature and social dynamics that transcend time and place. As we delve into Austen's works, we find a writer who is deeply aware of the world around her, its hierarchies, its injustices, and its potential for both happiness and heartbreak. Her novels invite us to look beyond the surface and explore the deeper truths about society and the human condition. Whether you're a lifelong fan or a newcomer to her world, there's always something new to discover in Jane Austen's timeless works. Jane Austen's cruelty is not the most obvious feature of much-loved novels like Pride and Prejudice, a work she once called too light and bright and sparkling. It once shade February 4, 1813. For all their satirical brio, the novels exude sympathy and understanding, and that is much of their appeal. But Virginia Woolf was on to something important when she wrote about Austen's preference for mockery over pity, and her distaste for dewy-eyed forgiveness, when reviewing a selection of early manuscripts that caused a minor sensation when first published in 1922. Never, even at the emotional age of 15, did she round upon herself in shame, obliterate a sarcasm in a spasm of compassion, or blur an outline in a mist of rhapsody, Woolf wrote. The newly available juvenilia helped readers tune into an aspect of Austen's art that was always there, and by 1940 the critic and psychologist D.W. Harding could write about her, in a landmark essay, as the great exponent of what he called regulated hatred. In her earliest writing, the imaginative cruelty is in fact deliciously unregulated, and coexists with other features that challenge received opinions about Austen, opinions the Victorian custodians of her reputation, who suppressed nearly all of it, were determined to uphold. Not only are the norms of compassion suspended in these youthful skits, but also many related norms, of decorum, morality, language, and narrative logic. Austen's manuscript works are striking achievements in their own right, and point to aspects of the published novels we might otherwise miss. Born in 1775, soon after the American War of Independence broke out, Austen grew up in comfortable respectability, if not quite prosperity, among the large family of the Rev. George Austen, a clergyman who held 2 modest livings in Hampshire and took boarding pupils on the side. Notable among her 7 siblings are Cassandra, Austen's elder and only sister, and Frank and Charles, the closest to her in age. Charles was her only junior in the family, who both became naval officers during the French Revolutionary War and rose to the rank of admiral. Another brother, Henry, was by turns militia officer, banker, bankrupt, and finally cleric. More helpful for the long-term security of the family, especially Jane and Cassandra, neither married, was Edward, an older brother whose adoption as heir to a wealthy cousin eventually brought him an income of £15,000 a year, half as much again as Mr. Darcy. When the money kicked in, however, it's fair to say that Edward gave no more than he had to. It was in this busy, happy environment that the teenage writings were composed, between 1787 and 1793, as handwritten documents for family circulation and scripts for comic recital. Austen was a virtuoso performer of her own prose, which Henry said was never heard to so much advantage as from her own mouth. She then transcribed the 27 surviving items into archly labeled mock books that mimicked print conventions, as though to form a wildly precocious collected works, Volume the First, Volume the Second, Volume the Third. Even after her career as a published author at last took off in 1811, the volumes remained in use by the family as agents of domestic sociability. Austen's nephew and niece, James Edward, Austen Leigh, and Anna Lefroy, contributed their own brief continuations of one item, the micronovel Evelyn. James Edward revised another, Kitty or the Bower, and it was probably he who changed the title to the more formal Catherine. The only item to see print over the next century was one of the least interesting, The Mystery, an unfinished comedy, which in 1871 was included by James Edward, now a bewhiskered, fox-hunting septuagenarian, in his memoir of Jane Austen, the book that enshrined her Victorian reputation. He included this fragment, however, with embarrassment. Like the rest of his revered aunt's juvenile effusions, it was flimsy and puerile, but worth recording as a specimen of the kind of transitory amusement which Jane was continually supplying to the family party. Effusion, transitory amusement, the words are worth dwelling on. The first of them carried a certain prestige in Austen's day, when Coleridge and Wordsworth, among others, employed it to distinguish particular poems as spontaneous, authentic outflows of creative imagination. High praise was also intended in Northanger Abbey, where Austen hails novels by Frances Burney and Maria Edgeworth, her leading female precursors, as the liveliest effusions of wit and humor, in the best chosen language v. In Victorian usage, however, effusion took on a pejorative edge, implying the absence of disciplining intelligence or structuring art. That criticism remained in play when the influential Austen editor R. W. Chapman, even as he ushered more juvenilia into print in 1933, worried about publishing such effusions as these. And it may be that we have enough already of Jane Austen's early scraps. Chapman's comment may explain why the last of the scraps, the surreal Evelyn and the mischievous Kitty, did not reach print until 1951. Transitory speaks for itself, fleeting, fugitive, disposable, though these volumes are now among the most cherished literary manuscripts in England, the more so because just one fragment, a pair of draft Persuasion chapters, survives from the major novels. But what about amusement? Here is another word with a double edge, meaning not only to entertain but also, at least potentially, to distract or mislead, like the unsafe amusements of amateur theatricals in Mansfield Park. 2.2. In the memoir, Austen Leigh quotes an anecdote from his sister Caroline, another fun-loving Regency child turned crusty Victorian, in which Aunt Jane warns her against writing too much while too young, and confesses of her own output that she knew writing stories was a great amusement, and she thought a harmless one, though many people, she was aware, thought otherwise. Let's take a look at Jane Austen through a lens that's often overlooked. When we think of her beloved novels like Pride and Prejudice, what usually comes to mind are the sharp wit, the romance, and the delightful satire. However, there's a side to Austen that's much less obvious, a certain cruelty in her humor, a sharp edge that cuts deeper than we might first notice. Austen herself hinted at this when she described Pride and Prejudice as too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade. For all their charm, her novels are not just playful, they carry a certain mockery, a refusal to soften or forgive too easily. The famous writer Virginia Woolf picked up on this aspect of Austen's work. Woolf noted how Austen, even as a young girl, preferred mockery over pity and never allowed her sharp observations to be clouded by compassion. In other words, Austen didn't shy away from highlighting the flaws in human nature, and she did so without letting sentimentality get in the way. This early aspect of her writing became more evident when some of Austen's youthful manuscripts were published in 1922, revealing a bolder, more unrestrained version of the author we know today. By 1940, a critic named D.W. Harding even described Austen as a master of what he called regulated hatred, pointing out that her early works, in particular, didn't just challenge the norms of compassion but also those of decorum, morality, and even logic. These manuscripts are more than just youthful experiments. They shine a light on elements of Austen's published works that we might otherwise miss. Now, Let's step back in time to understand where this bold young writer came from. Born in 1775, just after the American War of Independence began, Jane Austen was part of a large, close-knit family. Her father, Reverend George Austen, was a clergyman in Hampshire, and while the family lived comfortably, they were far from wealthy. Jane was the seventh of 8 children, and her siblings played significant roles in her life. Her only sister, Cassandra, was her closest confidant, while her brothers, particularly Frank and Charles, who became naval officers, were important figures in her world. Another brother, Henry, led a more colorful life, starting as a militia officer, then becoming a banker, experiencing bankruptcy, and finally ending up as a clergyman. Edward, the luckiest of the brothers, was adopted by a wealthy cousin and inherited a significant fortune, which eventually provided financial security for Jane and Cassandra, who never married. In this lively and sometimes chaotic household, Jane began writing at a young age. Between 1787 and 1793, she created a series of handwritten works meant to entertain her family. These early writings were playful and clever, often performed aloud, with Jane herself being the star performer. She later transcribed these pieces into mock books, humorously titled Volume the First, Volume the Second, and Volume the Third, as if they were a grand literary collection. Even after Jane began publishing her novels, these early volumes remained popular among her family, who continued to read and even add to them. One of the most intriguing aspects of Austen's early writings is the way they play with conventions. These youthful works don't just suspend the norms of compassion, they challenge the rules of decorum, morality, and even the structure of narrative itself. They are filled with clever nonsense and playful subversion, which might seem at odds with the more restrained, polished novels she later became famous for. It's no wonder that the Victorian custodians of her legacy were hesitant to publish these early works. They feared they might undermine her reputation as a serious novelist. Yet, as time passed, these early writings became more appreciated for what they were: brilliant, if unconventional, exercises in wit and satire. By the time they were fully published in the 20th century, critics like G.K. Chesterton began to see them as part of a literary tradition that included not just Austen's own mature works, but also the playful, anarchic spirit of writers like Rabelais and Dickens. Virginia Woolf herself, in reviewing these early writings, celebrated their sheer nonsense and the way they refused to conform to the expectations of polite society. So when we read Austen today, it's worth remembering that beneath the surface of her sparkling prose lies a mind that was always questioning, always challenging, and never entirely willing to play by the rules. Her early works, filled with wit and a certain unrestrained cruelty, are a testament to her extraordinary talent and her fearless approach to storytelling. In recent years, feminist critics have highlighted just how daring these early writings were. Imagine young Austen experimenting with ideas that challenged the norms of her time, like trying out a different path in her writing that she ultimately didn't follow. Some scholars believe these early stories were Austen's way of pushing back against the frustrations she faced before finally getting published in her mid-30s. It wasn't an easy journey. She had to navigate the restrictive expectations of published fiction back then, which often meant toning down her more rebellious instincts. Take Margaret and Doody, a prominent feminist critic, for example. She argues that the genre Austen had to fit into, the typical courtship novels of the day, wasn't exactly the right place for sharp social commentary or creative freedom, let alone questioning morals. Doody sees Austen's early works as a glimpse into a more unfiltered version of the author, someone who is a bit rough around the edges, playful, even a little rebellious. It's as if these early writings give us a taste of what Austen might have been like if she hadn't had to conform to the norms of her time. In other words, the young Austen we meet in these early works is different from the polished author we know from her later novels. One of the first things that stands out is Austen's love for playful wordplay. She invents these fantastically absurd place names like Crankham Dunbarry in Frederick and Elfrida and Pammy in Jack and Alice, setting the tone for the silly and whimsical worlds her characters inhabit. And then there are her characters, often given names that are just as outrageous. In Frederick and Elfrida, for example, she introduces us to Jezelinda, a mix of sentimental heroine and biblical figure, and Captain Roger of Buckinghamshire, a name that carried more than a hint of innuendo at the time. Austen doesn't shy away from sexual innuendo either. It's sprinkled throughout her work, sometimes subtly, sometimes more obviously, as in the cheeky jabs we see later in her novel Mansfield Park. But beyond the risque humor and wordplay, there's something almost Rabelaisian in Austen's joy for lists and absurd exaggerations. For instance, in Memoirs of Mr. Clifford, she enumerates a ridiculous number of carriages, everything from a coach to a curricle, and even a wheelbarrow. Or consider the feast in Frederick and Elfrida, where Charlotte tackles a mountain of game right after accidentally accepting 2 marriage proposals. It's over the top, and wonderfully so. When Charlotte decides to drown herself later, Austen's comic touch shines through again with an epitaph that's as clunky as it is hilarious. Austen also loved to invent fake proverbs, like when she writes, "Frederick was as bold as brass, yet in other respects his heart was as soft as cotton." These are all small but brilliant examples of how Austen took joy in turning language upside down. Austen often mixed high and low language, creating jarring yet delightful contrasts. In The Visit, a refined lady casually requests some fried cow heel and onion, a mix of genteel and downright earthy that's bound to make you chuckle. Then there's her use of epic diction for trivial matters, like in Jack and Alice, where she describes a character so dazzlingly beautiful that only eagles could look him in the face. It's all wonderfully overblown and unexpected, and Austen clearly revels in the absurdity of it all. The plots in these early works are just as wild and unpredictable as the language. In Evelyn, a tourist simply asks for his host's perfect estate, and without any fuss, they give it to him, daughter included, though they apologize for the measly £10,000 dowry. In Henry and Eliza, we see absurd exaggeration and contradiction, as when a character cries for the rest of her life, or another is introduced with a name that's immediately concealed. Austen also throws in bathos, a literary device where the lofty and trivial are jarringly mixed, as when a grove of majestic elms is paired with a bed of nettles in love and friendship. It's all absurd, and Austen delights in that absurdity. One of Austen's favorite tricks was to mimic the grand language of epic tales for completely mundane events, a style that echoes the humor of Laurence Sterne. She would lavish narrative attention on the most trivial things. A suspenseful elopement might be interrupted by a lengthy discussion about red cheeks, or a whole paragraph might be devoted to a family's debate over whether or not to open a door. In Henry and Eliza, she even blends wildly different settings without any explanation, a modern duchess one moment, a medieval warlord the next. It's all part of Austen's playful mockery of the uneven historical novels popular in her time, before the genre found its footing with authors like Walter Scott. Austen's satirical eye also extended to visual art. Her sister Cassandra's medallion portraits for the history of England present historical figures in anachronistic, ridiculous ways, Henry IV as a foppish dandy, and Henry V as a strutting officer, both in 18th century attire. These playful portraits aren't just poking fun. They're a gentle nod to Austen's own brother Henry, who was soon to become a militia officer himself. So, in Austen's early writings, we see a young woman bursting with creativity, humor, and a bit of rebellious spirit. She wasn't just making fun of the world around her, she was engaging with it in a way that was fresh, clever, and entirely her own. These early works are more than just youthful exercises. They're the foundation of the sharp, satirical voice that would define her later masterpieces. Her works often become especially popular during times of crisis, serving as a comforting escape to a world where manners and social norms take precedence over the chaos of war and revolution. Take, for instance, the First World War. An Oxford scholar, Herbert Brett Smith, was tasked with selecting reading materials for soldiers suffering from severe shell shock. His choice? Austen's novels, which he believed would provide these men with a soothing retreat from the horrors they had faced. Similarly, during the Second World War, Winston Churchill found solace in Pride and Prejudice while bedridden with pneumonia. He was struck by the calm and orderly lives of Austen's characters, lives untouched by the great geopolitical upheavals of their time. Churchill marveled at how these characters seemed unaffected by events like the French Revolution or the Napoleonic Wars. Instead, they were preoccupied with the delicate balancing act of controlling their passions within the rigid structures of social etiquette. Churchill's reaction highlights a common perception of Austen's work, that her novels are insular, focused solely on private, domestic concerns, and seemingly indifferent to the broader public events of her time. This view was so prevalent that when historian Warren Roberts published Jane Austen and the French Revolution in 1979, it was met with widespread skepticism. After all, what could Austen's genteel world of manners have to do with the bloody upheavals in France? Critics noted that while Austen's novels featured French windows, French cooks, and French bread, they made no mention of the French Revolution itself. The closest Austen came to addressing it was a brief reference in Northanger Abbey to the husband of novelist Frances Burney, who fled revolutionary France in 1792. Occasionally, a French warship would appear in her later novels, hinting at the Napoleonic Wars, but that was about it. But is this really a fair assessment? Was Austen truly a writer detached from the world around her, or is there more to her work than meets the eye? Some biographers suggest that Austen was indeed influenced by the tumultuous events of her time, albeit in subtle, indirect ways. Consider her cousin Eliza, who married a French royalist and whose first husband was executed by guillotine during the Revolution. Austen's brothers, Frank and Charles, served in the Royal Navy during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, experiencing firsthand the impact of these global conflicts. These personal connections may have shaped Austen's perspective, even if they did not overtly appear in her novels. In Northanger Abbey, Austen subtly captures the anxiety and tension of the Revolutionary era, particularly in the way her characters perceive the world around them. Henry Tilney, for example, refers to the presence of voluntary spies in society, while his sister Eleanor anxiously scans newspapers for reports of violence and bloodshed. Austen also playfully engages with the Gothic novel, a genre that was immensely popular during the 1790s, a time when literature often mirrored the terror and uncertainty of the age. Let's delve into how Austen uses parody in Northanger Abbey to critique the Gothic genre while also reflecting the concerns of her own time. The title itself is rich with meaning, hinting at the precarious social status of the heroine, Catherine, and her entanglement in a world where appearances can be deceiving. Like the hero of Cervantes' Don Quixote, who is so obsessed with chivalric romances that he misinterprets the world around him, Catherine's mind becomes dominated by the Gothic novels she devours in Bath. She arrives at Northanger Abbey expecting it to be just like the haunted, mysterious places she's read about, with dark secrets lurking around every corner. Gothic abbeys were a staple of the genre, offering endless possibilities for twisted plots involving religious corruption and sinister deeds. Austen was likely familiar with many of these Gothic novels, which were available through circulating libraries. Titles like Waldeck Abbey, The Horrors of Oakendale Abbey, and Graville Abbey were filled with the kind of clichés that Catherine eagerly anticipates. As she approaches General Tilney's home, she imagines its massy walls of grey stone, and ancient oaks bathed in the last rays of the sun, a scene straight out of a Gothic novel. But Austen doesn't give us the full Gothic treatment. Instead, she deflates Catherine's expectations with mundane reality. Northanger Abbey is not a crumbling ruin filled with ghosts and dark secrets, but a well-maintained modern home with light-filled rooms and all the comforts of contemporary life. The general's home is far removed from the gloomy, haunted abbey Catherine imagined. Austen uses this contrast to poke fun at the Gothic genre's excesses, while also commenting on the gap between fantasy and reality. However, Austen's parody goes beyond merely mocking Gothic conventions. She also engages with the genre's broader themes, particularly the sense of disempowerment and constraint that pervades both Gothic fiction and Catherine's own life. While Catherine doesn't scream out in terror like the heroines of the novels she reads, there's a genuine sense in which she feels trapped and powerless, much like them. The Gothic elements in Northanger Abbey serve not just as a source of humor, but also as a lens through which Austen explores the real anxieties and challenges faced by women in her time. In this way, Austen's engagement with the Gothic is not just about parody, but also about using the genre to explore deeper social and psychological themes. Northanger Abbey may play with the tropes of Gothic fiction, but it also offers a commentary on the constraints and limitations placed on women in the late 18th century. Catherine's experiences, both in Bath and at Northanger, reflect a broader reality in which women often found themselves disempowered, their lives shaped by forces beyond their control. Austen uses the Gothic as a means to highlight these issues, making her novel not just a parody, but a thoughtful critique of the society in which she lived. In a theory of parody advanced by the journalist William Hone just as Northanger Abbey came out, the mode could be divided into distinct categories. There were two kinds of parodies, Hone argued while being tried for blasphemous libel. He had parodied the liturgy one in which a man might convey ludicrous or ridiculous ideas relative to some other subject, the other, where it was meant to ridicule the thing parodied. A superficial account of Northanger Abbey would see it as a novel of female education that ridicules the thing parodied, Gothic fiction and the fashion for reading it. A naive, novel-obsessed heroine loses her grasp on reality, confuses a modern gentleman, General Tilney, with a Gothic villain, and is led out of her errors by a wise suitor, Henry. The cleverness of Austen's second volume lies in the mixed messages sent out about the general, but at one level he seems genial enough, not the Montoni of Catherine's imagination, but a harmless retiree who delights in growing fruit and renovating the kitchen. By imagining him instead as the murderer of his wife, Catherine has entertained grossly injurious suspicions inspired by her reading. But finally her mind is recalled from the alarms of romance to encounter and recognize, free of distraction from bad literature, the sober and salutary anxieties of common life, to X. Yet Austen uses Gothic fiction more ingeniously than this, and with something of Hone's outward movement. In the first place, although she enjoys sending up its more outre mannerisms, it's worth noting her refusal to denigrate it explicitly. She will not, like supercilious book reviewers, turn contemptuous censure on pulp fiction, i.e. For while it may be absurd to take Gothic novels literally as a guide to modern life, these novels aren't necessarily absurd in themselves, and when more thoughtfully approached as metaphors of evil, they may have real explanatory power. After all, the polite world of a modern spa still has its perils and pains, and through clever deployment of Gothic hyperbole in her opening volume, Catherine repeatedly suffers dread, mortification, agony, misery, torment. Austen draws quiet analogies between the trials of a Radcliffe heroine and the mundane but no less absorbing tribulations of an ingenue in predatory Bath. Catherine is manipulated and deceived by Isabella, and in effect abducted from Bath towards Blaise Castle by boorish John Thorpe. She's constrained, even imprisoned, in a world of regulated proprieties, the rules of the ballroom, the conventions of the assembly, and cynically exploited by friends or devious frenemies like Isabella, whose arm stays linked with hers though their hearts were at war. I.13. Her predicament is not literally that of a Gothic novel. Yet Gothic novels can still express and reveal modes of persecution and entrapment that continue to operate, though in new guise, in a world of polite sociability. In other ways, the abortive trip to Blaise Castle, while in the first place indicating the phoniness of the Gothic craze, also conveys sinister implications of an up-to-the-minute kind, and in this respect anticipates the disquieting slavery theme of Mansfield Park. Antiquity and atmosphere are promised by John Thorpe, and his words arouse in Catherine thrilling fantasies of lofty rooms, for many years deserted. I.11. Yet, as a good number of Austen's readers would have known, there was nothing authentic at all about Blaise Castle, an overblown exercise in cod medievalism that had been built as a folly by Thomas Farr, an 18th-century Bristol merchant whose wealth came from sugar and slaves. It's another of those moments at which Austen delicately associates the fashions and luxuries satirized in her fiction, the governess trade that worries Jane Fairfax, Emma, 2.17, the opulence of Sir Thomas Bertram's estate, with the pressing off-stage evil of Caribbean slavery. Even as Catherine's spine tingles at the thought of Blaise and its dungeons, Austen evokes the suffering not of medieval serfs but of modern slaves. But what of autocratic, avaricious General Tilney? On the face of it, the speech in which Henry disabuses Catherine of her suspicions supports Austen's dry observation, a page or two later, that Gothic novels are no guide to life in 1790s England. Yet Henry's speech is also a masterpiece of double meaning on Austen's part, and he inadvertently implicates the general even as he seems to exonerate him on the surface. Box 2. The general may not literally have confined his fevered wife in a turret, like Radcliffe's Montoni, or starved her to death. To cut through Henry's apologies and evasions, however, is to see that he committed a more muted modern version of the same crime, imprisoning his wife in a loveless marriage. We have not all the same tenderness of disposition, oppressing her in everyday life, she had much to bear, and assailing her with irrational anger, his temper injured her. Perhaps there's even a meaningful sense in which General Tilney did indeed kill his long-suffering wife, or at least give her little to live for. It's hard not to be reminded, at any rate, of her merely transactional meaning to the general when Henry concludes, still with conspicuous unease, that his value of her was sincere, and if not permanently, he was truly afflicted by her death. 2.9. Austen has already told us about the value in net worth terms of the former Miss Drummond, a wealthy heiress whose father had given her £20,000 and £500 to buy wedding clothes. I.9. Happily for the general, the cash outlasts his grief. It continues to fund the little luxuries of Northanger Abbey, the fruit trees, the kitchen gadgets, the costly gilding, as surely as the labor of slaves funds Mansfield Park. In 1932, the modernist author Rebecca West made a bold claim about Austen. She argued that Austen was not just aware of Enlightenment feminism, the movement that questioned and challenged the societal roles of women, but was also one of its sharpest voices. This might seem surprising to some because Austen's novels are often seen as stories of romance and manners, far removed from the political upheavals of her time. But West believed that the intellectual energy of the Revolutionary era permeated even the conservative, rural corners of England where Austen lived. It's not so shocking, West suggested, that Austen would put the institutions of society, especially those concerning women, under intense scrutiny just as Europe was grappling with the ideas of thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau, who argued that social institutions could and should be questioned. This claim about Austen might seem surprising at first, especially because novels, by their very nature, often sacrifice the clear, direct arguments found in political pamphlets or essays. Consider, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of woman, which was published just a few years before Austen began writing Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Northanger Abbey. Wollstonecraft's work is a straightforward, impassioned argument for women's rights, laying bare the societal mechanisms that trap women in roles of dependency and powerlessness. In contrast, Austen's novels explore similar themes but do so with a subtlety and complexity that might not immediately strike the reader as grueling criticism. However, West's claim has substance, and it's one that scholars have explored with increasing depth since the rise of feminist literary criticism in the latter half of the 20th century. Austen's Sense and Sensibility is a case in point. The novel tells the story of two sisters, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, who find themselves uprooted from their comfortable lives and reduced to financial insecurity due to the terms of a great-uncle's will. This theme, women's precarious and dependent condition in a world governed by property laws and inheritance practices, is one that runs parallel to the concerns of more overtly radical novels of the time, such as Elizabeth Inchbald's Nature and Art, Wollstonecraft's The Wrongs of Woman, and Mary Hayes's The Victim of Prejudice. These novels, like Sense and Sensibility, explore the vulnerabilities of women in a society that offers them little legal or financial protection. But Austen's exploration of these themes doesn't stop at Sense and Sensibility. In Northanger Abbey, she turns her attention to the popular literature of her time, particularly the Gothic novel. Gothic fiction, with its dark castles, mysterious villains, and terrified heroines, was all the rage when Austen wrote her first version of Northanger Abbey. The novel's heroine, Catherine Morland, becomes so absorbed in these fantastical tales that she begins to imagine that her own life is taking a similar sinister turn. When she visits the home of General Tilney, she half expects to find evidence of dark deeds hidden in the Abbey's rooms. On the surface, Northanger Abbey might seem like a simple parody, a light-hearted critique of the Gothic craze, showing how a young woman's overactive imagination leads her to absurd conclusions. However, Austen's satire is more layered than that. While she does poke fun at the Gothic genre's excesses, she also acknowledges the power of these stories to express genuine fears and anxieties. After all, the polite society of a modern spa town like Bath, where Catherine meets her friends and foes, has its own dangers. Catherine is manipulated and deceived by her so-called friend Isabella, and she faces the unwanted attentions of John Thorpe, who tries to whisk her away on an uninvited trip to Blaise Castle. Austen cleverly uses the exaggerated language of Gothic novels, words like dread, mortification, agony, and misery, to draw parallels between the melodramatic trials of a Gothic heroine and the real, if more mundane, challenges faced by a young woman navigating the social world of Bath. There's another layer of meaning in Austen's treatment of the Gothic, particularly in the aborted trip to Blaise Castle. John Thorpe's description of the castle stirs Catherine's imagination with visions of ancient rooms and hidden secrets. But in reality, Blaise Castle was a modern, artificial structure, a folly built in the 18th century by a Bristol merchant whose wealth came from the sugar trade and, by extension, the labor of enslaved people. In this subtle way, Austen connects the fashionable interests and luxuries of her characters with the darker realities of the world, hinting at the off-stage evils like the Caribbean slave trade, which financed the comfortable lives of many English families. As for General Tilney, Catherine's suspicions of him seem wildly off the mark. He's not the murderous villain she imagines, but a wealthy retiree who enjoys improving his estate. Yet Austen, ever the master of subtlety, leaves room for a different interpretation. While General Tilney might not have literally imprisoned or starved his wife to death, as Catherine fears, he did trap her in a loveless marriage and subjected her to a life of emotional neglect. In a more muted modern way, he might be guilty of causing his wife's misery, if not her death, through his harsh temperament and materialistic values. Even in his grief, the general's true sorrow seems to be over the loss of his wife's fortune rather than her companionship, as her wealth continues to fund his luxurious lifestyle at Northanger Abbey. Austen's novels, with their complex characters and intricate social critiques, do more than entertain. They offer a profound exploration of the societal constraints and injustices of her time. And through her subtle wit and keen observation, Austen challenges us to look beyond the surface of her stories to the deeper truths they reveal about the world in which she lived. However, West's claim has substance, and it's one that scholars have explored with increasing depth since the rise of feminist literary criticism in the latter half of the 20th century. Austen's Sense and Sensibility is a case in point. The novel tells the story of two sisters, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, who find themselves uprooted from their comfortable lives and reduced to financial insecurity due to the terms of a great-uncle's will. This theme, women's precarious and dependent condition in a world governed by property laws and inheritance practices, is one that runs parallel to the concerns of more overtly radical novels of the time, such as Elizabeth Inchbald's Nature and Art, Wollstonecraft's The Wrongs of Woman, and Mary Hayes's The Victim of Prejudice. These novels, like Sense and Sensibility, explore the vulnerabilities of women in a society that offers them little legal or financial protection. But Austen's exploration of these themes doesn't stop at Sense and Sensibility. In Northanger Abbey, she turns her attention to the popular literature of her time, particularly the Gothic novel. Gothic fiction, with its dark castles, mysterious villains, and terrified heroines, was all the rage when Austen wrote her first version of Northanger Abbey. The novel's heroine, Catherine Morland, becomes so absorbed in these fantastical tales that she begins to imagine that her own life is taking a similar sinister turn. When she visits the home of General Tilney, she half expects to find evidence of dark deeds hidden in the Abbey's rooms. On the surface, Northanger Abbey might seem like a simple parody, a light-hearted critique of the Gothic craze, showing how a young woman's overactive imagination leads her to absurd conclusions. However, Austen's satire is more layered than that. While she does poke fun at the Gothic genre's excesses, she also acknowledges the power of these stories to express genuine fears and anxieties. After all, the polite society of a modern spa town like Bath, where Catherine meets her friends and foes, has its own dangers. Catherine is manipulated and deceived by her so-called friend Isabella, and she faces the unwanted attentions of John Thorpe, who tries to whisk her away on an uninvited trip to Blaise Castle. Austen cleverly uses the exaggerated language of Gothic novels, words like dread, mortification, agony, and misery, to draw parallels between the melodramatic trials of a Gothic heroine and the real, if more mundane, challenges faced by a young woman navigating the social world of Bath. There's another layer of meaning in Austen's treatment of the Gothic, particularly in the aborted trip to Blaise Castle. John Thorpe's description of the castle stirs Catherine's imagination with visions of ancient rooms and hidden secrets. But in reality, Blaise Castle was a modern, artificial structure, a folly built in the 18th century by a Bristol merchant whose wealth came from the sugar trade and, by extension, the labor of enslaved people. In this subtle way, Austen connects the fashionable interests and luxuries of her characters with the darker realities of the world, hinting at the off-stage evils like the Caribbean slave trade, which financed the comfortable lives of many English families. As for General Tilney, Catherine's suspicions of him seem wildly off the mark. He's not the murderous villain she imagines, but a wealthy retiree who enjoys improving his estate. Yet Austen, ever the master of subtlety, leaves room for a different interpretation. While General Tilney might not have literally imprisoned or starved his wife to death, as Catherine fears, he did trap her in a loveless marriage and subjected her to a life of emotional neglect. In a more muted modern way, he might be guilty of causing his wife's misery, if not her death, through his harsh temperament and materialistic values. Even in his grief, The general's true sorrow seems to be over the loss of his wife's fortune rather than her companionship, as her wealth continues to fund his luxurious lifestyle at Northanger Abbey. Austen's novels, with their complex characters and intricate social critiques, do more than entertain. They offer a profound exploration of the societal constraints and injustices of her time. And through her subtle wit and keen observation, Austen challenges us to look beyond the surface of her stories to the deeper truths they reveal about the world in which she lived. Austen was meticulous about the details of money, property, and the impact these had on her characters' lives. Nowhere is this more evident than in the situation of the Dashwood sisters, Eleanor and Marianne, who find themselves suddenly thrust from comfort into a life of genteel poverty. Their troubles begin with the death of their father, who had inherited a large estate from their great-uncle. However, there's a catch. The estate is meant to pass to their half-brother, John Dashwood, after their father's death. Unfortunately, the early death of their father leaves no time for him to accumulate enough wealth to secure his daughter's future. This already challenging situation is worsened by their half-brother's moral weakness. Despite vaguely promising to help, John is easily manipulated by his wife, Fanny, who is as greedy as she is unkind, a character who stands out as one of Austen's most memorable antagonists. While their father's death is indeed a stroke of bad luck, the other factors, such as the patriarchal laws that favor male heirs and a society obsessed with wealth and status, highlight the broader social issues that Austen subtly critiques. The inheritance system, which prioritizes male descendants, leaves the Dashwood sisters, who need financial security the most, in a precarious situation. Meanwhile, their half-brother and his wife indulge in ostentatious displays of wealth, such as building a glass house on the estate, even as they cut down old walnut trees to make room for it. This reflects a culture of greed and consumption, often at the expense of those less fortunate. Austen also hints at the broader societal impact of such selfish behavior. For instance, the Dashwoods' concern over the cost of enclosing Norland Common, a process that would have deprived local peasants of their traditional rights, illustrates how the wealthy often prioritize their own gains over the well-being of the community. Austen leaves these consequences largely unstated, but her readers would certainly understand the implications. For Eleanor and Marianne, the path ahead is bleak. With few options available to them, their best hope lies in securing a wealthy husband. This reflects a broader issue that Mary Wollstonecraft, a pioneering feminist writer, had pointed out in her time. Women were often educated not for independence or achievement, but to become socially accomplished so they could marry well. Employment opportunities for women were limited and often menial, making marriage the most viable option for securing their future. Austen shares this concern in her novels. In Emma, for example, we see Mrs. Weston, who has struggled to shed her past as a governess, a role Wollstonecraft likened to slavery. Similarly, in Sense and Sensibility, the pressure to marry is palpable. Both Eleanor and Marianne fall in love, but they are at the mercy of social norms that give men the upper hand in courtship. Women, on the other hand, must wait, often anxiously, for a proposal and are expected to remain passive even as their futures hang in the balance. This imbalance of power allows men to be fickle and untrustworthy. Marianne is left heartbroken by Willoughby, who has a history of seduction and betrayal. Eleanor, too, suffers because of Edward Ferrars, whose indecisiveness and self-pity cause her considerable pain. The frustration and disappointment these women experience echo the experiences of many women in Austen's time, who were similarly constrained by societal expectations. In a modern context, Austen's exploration of these themes continues to resonate. Just think of Bridget Jones in Bridget Jones's Diary. Her humorous resolution to avoid men who are emotionally unavailable or unreliable mirrors the challenges faced by Eleanor and Marianne, highlighting how these issues are still relevant today. Through the lens of wealth and marriage, Sense and Sensibility reveals much about the precariousness of women's lives in Austen's time. It's not just a love story, it's a critique of the societal structures that leave women vulnerable and dependent on the whims of men. And it's in this delicate balance between social commentary and storytelling that Austen's genius truly shines. Sense and Sensibility, a novel that, at first glance, might seem like a simple story of love and loss, but it's much more. When one of the novel's early reviewers picked it up, they saw it as something akin to a guidebook for behavior, a kind of fictionalized manual on how to navigate life's ups and downs, especially in the realm of emotions and social expectations. The title itself sets the stage. Sense represents sobriety, fortitude, and self-command, qualities that keep you grounded. On the other hand, sensibility is the force of unrestrained emotion, which can be beautiful, but also potentially destructive. In Austen's time, novels like Sense and Sensibility were not uncommon. They often featured characters who were either models of proper behavior or cautionary tales of emotional excess. When Austen penned Sense and Sensibility in the 1790s and published it in 1811, she was entering a literary scene filled with stories of young women navigating love, society, and the expectations placed upon them. Austen's novel, with its focus on female experience and emotion, was in many ways a part of this popular genre. It's no wonder that her story resonated with so many. It mirrored the lives and struggles of real women of the time, wrapped up in the familiar and marketable format of courtship fiction. Now let's dig deeper into the characters of Eleanor and Marianne, the two sisters at the heart of the story. From the very beginning, Austen sets up a clear contrast between them. Eleanor, the elder sister, is the epitome of sense. She is rational, composed, and always in control of her emotions. Marianne, on the other hand, embodies sensibility. She wears her heart on her sleeve, is driven by her feelings, and often finds herself overwhelmed by her emotions. This dynamic is not just a simple contrast, it's a profound exploration of the human experience. Throughout the novel, we see Marianne express her emotions in ways that might seem exaggerated to us today, but were quite typical of the sentimental heroines in literature at the time. When she is abandoned by Willoughby, the man she loves, her reaction is one of intense, almost theatrical despair. She falls into what Austen describes as a silent agony, too oppressed even to cry. In contrast, when Eleanor faces her own romantic disappointments, she maintains her composure, keeping her pain hidden from the world. This difference in how the sisters handle their emotions is crucial to understanding the themes of the novel. But Austen doesn't just leave it at that. She complicates the picture. While Marianne's emotional outbursts might seem foolish, they also serve as a form of protest against the societal norms that restrict her. Marianne's refusal to suppress her emotions can be seen as a rebellion against the expectations placed on women to be demure, reserved, and above all, in control. Eleanor's self-command, while admirable, also makes her complicit in a system that values stoicism over emotional honesty. Austen, through her narrative, invites us to question whether the repression of emotions is truly a virtue, or if it is simply a way of maintaining social order at the expense of personal happiness. As the story unfolds, the lines between sense and sensibility begin to blur. Eleanor, who starts off as the embodiment of sense, learns to appreciate the value of emotions. Marianne, who initially rejects the idea of self-control, begins to see the importance of restraint. Austen's characters are not static, they grow and evolve, challenging the reader to reconsider their own understanding of these concepts. In fact, the title Sense and Sensibility might suggest a straightforward opposition between reason and emotion, but Austen's novel is anything but simple. It's a nuanced exploration of the interplay between these forces, showing how they can both complement and conflict with each other. For example, Colonel Brandon, a character who seems to embody sense, also displays deep sensibility in his actions. He is both rational and deeply feeling, illustrating that these qualities are not mutually exclusive, but can coexist in a balanced and harmonious way. Austen's novel is also a commentary on the broader social structures of her time. The story of Eleanor and Marianne is not just about personal relationships, it's about how societal expectations and economic realities shape the lives of women. The inheritance laws that leave the Dashwood sisters financially vulnerable, the social conventions that restrict their choices, and the pressures to marry well, all of these elements reflect the limited options available to women in Austen's world. Sense and Sensibility is a rich, complex novel that goes beyond the simple dichotomy suggested by its title. Through the experiences of Eleanor and Marianne, Austen explores the delicate balance between reason and emotion, the constraints of societal norms, and the ways in which individuals navigate the expectations placed upon them. It's a novel that continues to resonate because it touches on the universal human experience of trying to find that balance in our own lives. Whether we lean more towards sense or sensibility, Austen reminds us that both have their place, and that the journey to reconcile the two is what makes us truly human. One of Austen's most famous novels, Pride and Prejudice, is a shining example of her mastery in storytelling. But what makes this novel truly brilliant? At its core, it's the way Austen uses language so efficiently and with such restraint, packing meaning into every moment without wasting a single word. When Austen first tried to publish her novel, originally titled First Impressions, her father compared its length to a much longer work, Evelina by Frances Burney. However, by the time Pride and Prejudice was published in 1813, Austen had significantly trimmed down the text, much like a gardener carefully pruning a plant to ensure it grows just right. She even mentioned in a letter to her sister that she had lopped and cropped the manuscript, which means she cut out unnecessary parts to improve the overall shape of the story. One area where Austen made these cuts was in the dialogue, particularly the tags like he said or she said that help guide the reader through conversations. While she acknowledged that these cuts might make some parts of the dialogue less clear, the benefit was a faster, more engaging pace. This choice, though it sacrifices a bit of clarity, adds energy to the dialogue, making it sparkle and giving the novel its lively, dynamic feel. Austen had a playful side, too. She joked that unlike other novelists of her time, she didn't pad her novels with irrelevant essays or critiques just to bulk up the content. Instead, she adhered to a minimalist approach, focusing on what truly mattered, the voice and the characters. She advised her niece, who was also a budding writer, to avoid overloading her stories with unnecessary details and to let the reader's imagination fill in the blanks. Austen's brilliance lies in her ability to create a narrative that feels both intimate and expansive. In Pride and Prejudice, she balances this by occasionally stepping back from the characters to offer her own wry observations, much like a wise friend sharing insights. For instance, Austen humorously comments on Mrs. Bennet, a character notorious for her lack of sense, wishing she could say that the events of the novel made Mrs. Bennet a better person, but knowing full well that they didn't. These moments of authorial intrusion are rare but powerful, adding depth to the story and reminding us of Austen's guiding hand. Some literary critics have debated whether these moments detract from Austen's otherwise subtle style. They argue that Austen's narration is so skillfully non-intrusive that any direct authorial voice could be seen as a flaw. However, these brief interruptions are part of Austen's charm, offering readers a glimpse into her thoughts and inviting them to engage more deeply with the text. One of the most striking aspects of Pride and Prejudice is how Austen uses the narrator's voice to subtly guide the reader's understanding. Early in the novel, she presents us with a sharp yet compassionate analysis of the Bennet marriage, making us rethink our initial judgments. Mr. Bennet's sarcastic humor, which initially seems amusing, is revealed as a coping mechanism for a marriage that has left him deeply unhappy. Through these insights, Austen challenges us to consider the moral implications of the characters' actions, leading us to a more nuanced understanding of the story. However, Austen doesn't spoon-feed her readers. She prefers to let us figure things out for ourselves, much like her heroine Elizabeth Bennet does throughout the novel. This approach draws us into the narrative, making us active participants in the process of discovery. Austen's subtlety extends to her handling of character motivations, particularly with figures like Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, whose thoughts and feelings are often left ambiguous, forcing us to piece together clues from their behavior. This technique of withholding information and even misleading the reader mirrors the uncertainty that Elizabeth faces, making us feel her frustrations and triumphs as she navigates the complexities of social interactions and personal growth. It's no wonder that modern scholars are fascinated by how Austen's writing engages the brain, encouraging us to read more attentively and think more deeply. In essence, Austen's Pride and Prejudice is a masterpiece of narrative efficiency and wit, inviting readers into a world where every word counts, and where the interplay between character, dialogue, and narrative voice creates a rich, immersive experience. Whether you're new to Austen or a longtime fan, there's always something new to discover in the elegant simplicity of her storytelling. The narrative style seamlessly merged with the thoughts and feelings of characters, almost as if the story is being told from their own point of view, known as free indirect discourse, was first clearly identified by the French writer Gustave Flaubert in the 1850s. Jane Austen, however, was an early master of this technique, even though she wasn't the first to use it. In her novels, free indirect discourse becomes a powerful tool for bringing characters' inner lives to the forefront, making their experiences feel immediate and vivid. Before Austen and her contemporaries, you can find some earlier uses of this technique, but none that compare in depth and consistency to what she achieved. Austen's novels vividly showcase the key elements of free indirect discourse, which include a few distinctive features. For one, she often omits the usual reporting phrases like he said or she thought, allowing the narrative to blend seamlessly with the character's perspective. This approach makes the story feel more intimate and dynamic. Some notable markers of this technique include the use of words and phrases that reflect a character's own point of view rather than a detached narrator's. For example, Austen might use words like now and here instead of then and there, or include direct questions and exclamations that mirror the character's emotional state. She also uses informal language and personal quirks, like Mr. Collins's pompous and overly polite speech, which adds a layer of satire and humor. Austen's use of free indirect discourse becomes especially pronounced in her later novels. In Pride and Prejudice, it serves to capture the unique voice and perspective of each character. Take Mr. Collins's visit to Longbourn, for instance. Austen starts with a straightforward impersonal narration, but then shifts into a more mocking tone as she highlights Mr. Collins's absurdity. This transition is made possible by the build-up provided by Mr. Collins's grandiose letter and Mr. Bennet's humorous reaction. Austen's ability to shift from narrative summary to reported speech, and then to the character's own exaggerated expressions, adds a rich layer of satire and character insight. In essence, free indirect discourse allows Austen to paint a detailed and engaging portrait of her characters, blending their voices with the narrative in a way that enhances both the storytelling and the emotional impact of the novel. In the 1950s, Cornell University students studying under the renowned novelist Vladimir Nabokov tackled Mansfield Park before progressing to works like Bleak House, Madame Bovary, and eventually Proust and Joyce. Nabokov, who didn't hold Pride and Prejudice in particularly high regard, favored Mansfield Park for its intricate plot. He praised its thematic unity and the way Austen masterfully intertwines key episodes, such as the Southerton outing and the lovers' vows rehearsal. These scenes, rich in planning and scheming, explore themes of boundary crossing, both material and moral, and the unleashing of forbidden passions. Nabokov admired how each theme in the novel unfolds like the petals of a domestic rose, creating a beautifully orchestrated narrative. Today, however, Mansfield Park is often viewed through a different lens, reflecting the evolving critical debates. Surprisingly, the novel is now seen as a commentary on offstage events and unspoken themes, focusing more on its global implications rather than just domestic affairs. While Nabokov was among the early critics to note the economic benefits derived from slave labor on Sir Thomas Bertram's estates in Antigua, this aspect was not fully explored during his time. It wasn't until Edward Said's influential work Culture and Imperialism in 1993 that the issue of slavery took center stage in literary criticism of Austen's work. Said highlighted that, while Mansfield Park is notable for its artistic and intellectual achievements, it also has a significant blind spot regarding slavery. Austen briefly mentions the slave trade but does not integrate it into the moral fabric of the novel. Said's analysis has spurred a range of responses, including some nuanced and others more critical, particularly in adaptations of Mansfield Park. Patricia Razima's 1999 film, for instance, includes scenes that highlight the plight of African slaves, adding a new dimension to the story. The film portrays Sir Thomas Bertram, played by Harold Pinter, as a guilt-ridden figure who eventually sells his estate in Antigua, reflecting the historical context in which slavery was becoming increasingly scrutinized. Austen herself, shortly after Pride and Prejudice was published, mentioned in a letter to her sister Cassandra that she was planning to write about a different subject, ordination. This refers to the formal admission of clergy into the Anglican Church. However, it's intriguing to consider that Austen's work might also be viewed as a failure to address, or at least a shift away from, the topic of slavery. This raises questions about how we might interpret this change in focus and whether we can draw connections between what is explicitly discussed in Mansfield Park and what remains unsaid. In Mansfield Park, silence plays a crucial role. When Edmund discusses clerical duty during the Southerton outing, his speech is met with a general silence, signaling a shift away from the topic. This pattern of silence recurs throughout the novel, where it serves as a form of communication that Austen carefully defines, whether determined, gloomy, indignant, luxurious, or thoughtful. Silence in the novel often conceals deeper meanings and motives. Characters like Fanny Price, who tends to be silent when feeling strongly, and others who are rendered speechless by various circumstances, reveal much through their silences. These moments invite readers to explore underlying emotions, hidden desires, or subtle acts of bad faith. In Austen's narrative, silence is never merely the absence of speech but a significant element that enriches the story's depth and complexity. In 1811, the then Prince Regent, George IV, known for his extravagant lifestyle and passion for novels, purchased a copy of Jane Austen's debut work, Sense and Sensibility, even before it was advertised in newspapers. Austen would probably not have celebrated this early endorsement. The prince's bulk order included a variety of lesser-known novels like Sicilian Mysteries, The Monk's Daughter, and The Capricious Mother, placing Austen among fairly inconsequential company. Additionally, Austen had strong negative feelings toward the Prince Regent himself, who was widely criticized for his questionable behavior. She openly supported the prince's estranged wife in their public marital disputes, expressing her disdain with unusual fervor. "Poor woman, I shall support her as long as I can, because she is a woman, and because I hate her husband." February 16, 1813. When Emma was being prepared for publication in 1815, Austen was asked by the prince's librarian, James Stanier Clark, to dedicate the book to the Prince Regent. Although this request was more of an order, Austen complied with a dedication that was, by the standards of the time, notably brief and unenthusiastic. Her dedication, a terse 29-word note, repeatedly mentions the prince's title without acknowledging any personal virtues or qualities. This irony is particularly striking given that Emma offers a thorough exploration of social and moral issues in England, yet the dedication fails to praise the man responsible for upholding such values. The implication is clear: to understand the deeper moral and social insights of the novel, one must look beyond the superficialities of the dedication. As Emma approaches its dramatic climax at Box Hill, a point where a seemingly minor social slight becomes the centerpiece of the narrative, Austen provides her most vivid depiction of the English countryside. The landscape is portrayed with a combination of realism and romanticism, a summer day with autumnal hints and springtime blossoms creating a timeless pastoral scene. Austen's description is lush and detailed, blending the seasons in a way that captures both the beauty and the complexity of the rural setting. Her portrayal of the landscape seems almost designed for cinematic adaptation, with soft focus imagery that enhances our perception of her world. Austen once remarked that 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on, September 9, 1814, though she occasionally deviated from this focus. Emma is particularly noteworthy for its detailed portrayal of a single setting, a village so large it borders on being a town, and it uses this setting to reflect the broader national context. The village of Highbury is precisely located, 16 miles from London, 9 from Richmond, and 7 from Box Hill, though these distances are more illustrative than exact. The community is busy but not yet suburbanized, maintaining connections to metropolitan life while being self-sufficient with local produce like turnips and cheese. The characters are well connected both locally and nationally, traveling to Bath, Oxford, Yorkshire, and beyond, and showcasing regional goods. Austen's novels often explore the intricacies of social rank rather than class, and Emma is a prime example of this focus. Through the protagonist, Emma Woodhouse, Austen meticulously examines the nuances of social hierarchy and mobility in Regency England. Emma's interactions and judgments reflect her commitment to maintaining social boundaries, illustrating the complex system of rank and privilege. Highbury's society is depicted as a microcosm of genteel and middle-class life, featuring various tiers of social standing from the esteemed Mr. Knightley at the top to the struggling Miss Bates at the bottom. Interestingly, the novel minimizes the presence of aristocrats, focusing instead on the genteel middle class and the professional figures like the apothecary Mr. Perry. Early readers noticed this absence, comparing Emma to other works that highlighted the upper echelons of society. The novel's portrayal of social stratification is detailed and acute, emphasizing the competitive and often anxious nature of social positioning. Emma's reluctance to associate with individuals outside her social sphere, like the yeoman farmers, underscores her own insecurities about her status. The tension between different social classes is evident in the competition for social standing. Characters like Mr. Elton, who marries into wealth, are viewed with disdain by Emma, while others, like Mrs. Elton, express their own prejudices. This ongoing negotiation of social rank reveals the difficulty of achieving true social acceptance, as opposed to merely acquiring wealth. Austen's portrayal of the Weston family's gradual rise in gentility exemplifies the slow and contentious process of securing social respectability. Through Emma, Austen offers a rich and nuanced analysis of England's social fabric, exploring how gentility and prosperity intersect and influence one another in a competitive and ever-shifting landscape. Emma stands in stark contrast to the condition of England novels of Austen's mid-19th century successors, like Elizabeth Gaskell and Charles Dickens, who tackled the challenges of urbanization and industrialization. Austen's work offers only brief glimpses into the commercial centers of England. For instance, Mrs. Elton's wealth is linked to Bristol, potentially tied to the slave trade, even though her wealthy brother-in-law is supposedly an abolitionist. Austen's disdain for up-and-coming individuals from places like Birmingham is evident when she criticizes them for trying to elevate their status to that of long-established families. 2.18. Though Austen had a fondness for London, describing it with a mix of delight and moral concern during an early visit, August 23, 1796, it remains an off-stage presence in her novels. Despite London's burgeoning population of over 1 million, Austen's world remains predominantly rural, as depicted in Emma. Moreover, Emma is not a national tale in the vein of Scottish or Irish authors like Walter Scott and Maria Edgeworth, who used romance traditions to explore broader questions of British identity. Austen's focus is distinctly English, grounded in her own observations. When advising her niece Anna on writing, Austen suggested avoiding unfamiliar settings, like Ireland, if one does not know them well. August 18, 1814. Consequently, when Colonel Campbell and Emma travels to Ireland, Austen leaves their story behind. In a review of Emma, Scott highlighted the differences between the grand national narratives of Celtic identity and Austen's detailed portrayal of everyday English life. While Edgeworth employed sweeping romantic elements to illustrate national character, Austen concentrated on the mundane details of daily life with precision. Scott himself admired Austen's exceptional ability to capture the ordinary, noting that her talent for depicting everyday feelings and characters was unparalleled. Edgeworth, on the other hand, did not appreciate Austen's focus on characters like Mr. Woodhouse and his gruel, leading her to abandon Emma after the first volume. Nevertheless, Austen's commitment to domestic realism provides a unique kind of national tale. Her rejection of grand historical narratives does not mean she dismisses the exploration of national identity. Instead, she delves into the present moment with careful attention to detail. This approach is exemplified in a correspondence with James Stanier Clark, who suggested Austen write a romance about the Prince Regent's daughter marrying into the Saxe-Coburg dynasty. Austen humorously agreed on April Fool's Day that such a historical romance might be more profitable or popular, but firmly decided to stick to her own style, focusing on what she knew best: contemporary English life. In 1815, the year Emma was published, England was experiencing significant turmoil. Percy Shelley's sonnet, England in 1819, published posthumously, portrays a vision of a decaying George III, symbolizing corrupt authority and political oppression. Although this poem came out after Austen's death, it reflects the broader context of economic and social unrest that marked her writing period. This era was characterized by poor harvests, food shortages, high unemployment, and widespread protests against industrialization and mechanization, known as Luddism. The administration of Lord Liverpool, Prime Minister since 1812, mishandled these crises, exacerbating social tensions. The underlying issues included significant structural changes driven by rising commerce and finance, which disrupted traditional social relationships and empowered a new elite unburdened by previous obligations. Former radicals like Wordsworth and Coleridge, who had shifted from revolutionary zeal to conservative views, criticized this emerging greed-driven society. Wordsworth, in a letter written shortly after Emma was published, expressed his concerns about the fragmentation of society and the erosion of communal bonds in this burgeoning capitalist world. In the Victorian era, and continuing into our own time, Jane Austen's works have faced criticism for what some see as their lack of emotional depth. Critics have argued that while Austen's novels are meticulously detailed in their portrayal of domestic life and the complexities of social interactions, they often fail to delve into the deeper, more intense realms of psychological or psychosexual experience. Charlotte Brontë, author of the emotionally charged novel Jane Eyre, 1847, felt that Austen excelled at capturing the outer layers of genteel English life but missed the inner turmoil of human emotions. Brontë critiqued Austen for focusing too much on external details like what her characters see, say, and do, rather than exploring the deeper, more hidden aspects of their emotional lives. She argued that Austen's characters lacked the throbbing, visceral intensity that lies beneath the surface of human existence, highlighting this difference with a somewhat dismissive tone, Miss Austen. American readers also joined in this critique, connecting their disdain for Austen's detailed depiction of upper-class life with a broader critique of British culture. Figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson described Austen's world as pinched and narrow, while Ezra Pound saw her novels as reflections of a dull, stupid, hemmed-in sort of life. However, there was a strong counter-argument from those who appreciated Austen's more subtle approach. Henry James, a key figure in the development of psychological realism in literature, offered a different perspective. He viewed Austen's heroines as embodying pure, undistracted emotion, albeit in a less overt manner. According to James, Austen's later works, such as Emma and Persuasion, convey intense passion, but this emotion is often hidden beneath a veneer of social propriety. In Austen's world, the emotional intensity is not suppressed but rather modified by the constraints of social expectations. This insight is especially relevant in Persuasion, where the novel centers on the long-term suppression of passion and its eventual powerful resurgence. Austen's ability to evoke deep emotion through a seemingly restrained surface is a testament to her skill in exploring the hidden depths of her characters' lives. Jane Austen's Persuasion often feels like the culmination of her writing career, though it only ended up being her final completed novel due to her untimely death. Some believe that Austen may not have fully finished it, despite the last chapter's enthusiastic lead-up to a happy ending. The novel's somewhat unfinished feel is more about its style than its plot. The prose in Persuasion is notably more jagged and unsettled compared to the smooth epigrammatic clarity seen in Emma or Pride and Prejudice. This stylistic choice contributes to the novel's intense emotional atmosphere. The characters in Persuasion experience a restless agitation, and this emotional turbulence is mirrored in the novel's informal, almost expressionistic style, which was a new venture for Austen. Before her health prevented further writing, Austen mentioned in a letter to her niece Fanny Knight in March 1817 that Persuasion was nearly ready for publication, suggesting she intended to let it sit for a while before making final revisions. Had Austen lived longer, she might have polished the novel further, smoothing out its rougher edges. Persuasion stands as a poignant, almost unfinished piece of Austen's creative work. Yet, it also seems to be a reflective or recapitulatory work, offering a kind of resolution for both Austen and her protagonist, and Eliot. There's a compelling idea, shared by Virginia Woolf among others, that an Eliot might be the character with whom Austen felt the closest personal connection. The novel deeply explores themes of memory and the impact of past decisions on the present and future. Persuasion reveals Austen's evolving emotional and intellectual depth. And Eliot, at 27, is Austen's most mature heroine. She reflects on lost youth and missed romantic opportunities with a sense of wistfulness and regret. Unlike Austen's younger heroines, and begins the story having already experienced the pain of rejecting the man she still loves. For Woolf, this portrayal of regret in Persuasion reveals not just Austen's past love, but also her courage to express those emotions openly. The novel presents and in a state of emotional stagnation, akin to the grim autumnal settings described in the book. Austen captures a sense of declining happiness through the bleak, rainy landscapes surrounding her. This stagnant state echoes the broader themes Austen has explored in her previous novels, where social and economic pressures often hinder characters' happiness. In Persuasion, these pressures are exemplified by the influence of a mentor who deems Captain Wentworth an unsuitable match due to his social rank and income. Persuasion also revisits themes from Austen's earlier works. In early 1816, Austen reclaimed an earlier draft of Northanger Abbey and was revising it alongside Persuasion. Although she didn't plan their joint publication, she saw connections between the two novels. Both are set in Bath, an urban environment that allows Austen to satirize fashion and social pretense. Bath serves as a backdrop for both novels, showcasing the social dynamics of the time. Another shared interest between the novels is the impact of reading on individuals. Northanger Abbey explores how Gothic fiction can distort perceptions, while Persuasion introduces Captain Benwick, a male reader whose obsession with romantic poetry leads to emotional paralysis. This portrayal subverts typical stereotypes, as Benwick, a naval hero, becomes overwhelmed by the very romantic ideals that would traditionally be associated with women. And Eliot's conversation with Benwick highlights the irony of his situation. She suggests that poetry, while powerful, can lead to an imbalance in emotions, advocating instead for rational prose, a nod to Austen's critique of such rational approaches in Northanger Abbey. Anne's advice reflects her own struggle to reconcile her intense emotions with rational thought, showcasing Austen's nuanced exploration of inner life and personal conduct. In Persuasion, Jane Austen explores new dimensions while continuing her sharp analysis of social hierarchies. Though Austen often depicted society as divided into rigid classes, Persuasion introduces a more meritocratic perspective. This shift builds on earlier works like Mansfield Park and Emma, which started to highlight the value of professions and social classes beyond the traditional elite. In Persuasion, this idea is taken further with a sharper, more satirical edge. For example, Sir Walter Elliot, Anne's father, is portrayed as a vain and shallow man obsessed with his own social status. The arrival of the Dowager Viscountess Dalrymple and her daughter, who are revealed to be insignificant and lacking in real superiority, further mocks the hollow nature of inherited titles. Austen shows that true nobility is now found elsewhere, and outdated titles are portrayed as relics of a bygone era, unable to adapt to a world in need of change and renewal. Austen sets Persuasion in the summer of 1814, a time just before the brief resurgence of war after Napoleon's exile. This period is significant, as it falls between Napoleon's abdication and the final defeat at Waterloo, which boosted British military prestige. Austen's personal connection to this period is evident, influenced by her naval brothers. The Royal Navy, which played a crucial role in protecting Britain and its colonies, is portrayed positively in the novel. Captain Wentworth and his fellow officers are depicted as models of virtue and progress, not only in their professional lives but also in their domestic behavior. Austen's final printed words reflect admiration for the Navy's contribution to national progress and its domestic virtues, though with a touch of irony, suggesting that the peace the characters enjoy might soon be disrupted again. Admiral Croft, another naval character, contrasts sharply with the land-bound General Tilney from Northanger Abbey. The Crofts are depicted with great warmth and affection, unpretentious, jovial, and deeply in love. This portrayal highlights a stark contrast between the aristocratic, stagnant Sir Walter Elliot and the dynamic, hard-working Crofts. Sir Walter, who scorns the Navy for elevating individuals of humble origins, ultimately loses his estate to the Crofts, symbolizing a shift in social values. However, Austen doesn't shy away from showing the more humorous side of her naval characters. Despite their impressive achievements at sea, Captain Benwick's emotional reaction to poetry and Admiral Croft's clumsy driving on land add a touch of levity. These moments remind us that for Austen, humor often takes precedence over rigid thematic consistency. In the end, Persuasion combines a critique of social structures with a celebration of the virtues found in unexpected places, all while maintaining Austen's characteristic wit and insight. Jane Austen's novels offer a rich tapestry of social commentary, emotional depth, and literary innovation. From the keenly observed societal structures of Pride and Prejudice to the introspective and poignant exploration of personal regret in Persuasion, Austen's works continue to captivate and resonate with readers across generations. Austen's writing reflects a keen awareness of the social hierarchies and economic pressures of her time, but she also imbues her characters with a depth and humanity that transcend these constraints. Her heroines, whether navigating the rigid class structures or confronting their own inner conflicts, emerge as complex and relatable figures. In novels like Emma and Persuasion, Austen explores themes of social mobility, personal growth, and the transformative power of love and self-awareness. Her ability to blend sharp satire with genuine empathy allows her to critique societal norms while also celebrating the virtues of her characters. Through her nuanced portrayals of social dynamics, Austen challenges the reader to reflect on issues of class, gender, and personal integrity. Whether it is the satirical portrayal of societal pretensions in Emma or the more introspective and emotionally charged narrative of Persuasion, Austen's work invites us to examine the ways in which our own lives are shaped by the social structures around us. Ultimately, Austen's novels remain a testament to her literary genius and her enduring relevance. They offer not just a window into the past, but also a mirror reflecting the complexities of human relationships and societal expectations. As we continue to read and appreciate her work, we engage in a timeless conversation about the human condition, one that Jane Austen herself so elegantly and insightfully began.